My name is Kalideep Chaudhary. I'm the chair of the Asia Pac Affairs at the Commonwealth Club. And so welcome. We begin with, if you think that politicians complaining about trade imbalances are something new, you should have heard them 2,000 years ago. And so this is Pliny the Elder, the Roman statesman and politician, sneeringly complaining about the treasures of Rome. Some claim up to a third of the treasures of Rome going into to pay for luxurious Indian goods, so that, and he considered India the sink of the world's most precious metals, just so that the Roman matron could wear and flaunt see-through clothes, just so that Caligula's consort could wear Indian textiles and Indian jewelry, 50 million sesterces worth of Indian emeralds. So as you can see, including blaming women for all of society's problems, a few things have changed. And so in his dazzling new book, William Dalrymple argues to look way beyond the Silk Route, which many of us are familiar with. And that centuries before the Silk Route, there were these great trade routes that linked the disparate empires of Rome to the countries of Korea and Japan, linking them all together for about 1,000 years, so that Indian goods, aesthetics, ideas dominated this space. And vast profits were made from cloth, from spices, from jewelry, from oils, ivory, glass, and furniture. But beyond this idea of trade lies a greater idea. And Mr. Dalrymple's larger theme is India's intellectual hegemony. And as he shows, during this era, India was a great religious and philosophical superpower of Eurasia. And during this time, ideas such as the religion of Buddhism, mathematics that introduced the idea of zero and infinity, and trigonometry and algebra, and astronomy that proposed a spherical Earth rotating on its own axis, India dominated the space. But it is more than hard power. It is about soft power. It is a role about how ideas and influences and self-transformation infected and dominated the world. And with that, I welcome Mr. Dalrymple. He's, as many of you know, a noted historian and best-selling author of many books. The list of his accomplishments are far too many to accommodate in the short time that we have here. But ever since he's one of Barack Obama's, his book, The Anarchy, was Barack Obama's favorite book of 2019. He hosts the world's largest Writers' Festival, the Jaipur Literature Festival, and his books have won numerous awards and prizes, including the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award. On a personal note, Mr. Dalrymple belongs to that peculiar breed of Englishmen, in his case Scottish.
Oh, Englishman? No.
In his case Scottish, who has fallen mad.
I say the peculiar breed of Indian that's not a Pakistani.
Who have fallen madly in love with India. I've known a few myself, and I can tell you quite a few of them are stark raving mad. And so with that, I would like to welcome Mr. Dalrymple to the Commonwealth Club and to San Francisco. So, William, if you may, let us start with this book. Let us start with the genesis. What led to this book? What were the ideas, and why today?
So this book came from a growing conviction that we've all, in a sense, become colonized, in the sense that Western educations still, in 2025, so privilege the Western world that anyone here who was not brought up as you were in India will, by the age of 7 or 8, learn about Archimedes in his bath shouting Eureka. By the age of 10, most of you will have studied and understood Pythagoras' theorem. But only those of you who were educated in South Asia could possibly have been brought up hearing equivalent and possibly greater figures, such as Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta, you alluded to by saying the idea that the Earth's spinning on its own axis, also calculated the exact circumference of the Earth, the exact distance of the Earth from the sun. This wonderful image, he says, that through the boat of my own intellect, I sought the jewel of true knowledge lost in the ocean, or something, a lovely image like that. And then his ideas are taken forward by another figure called Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta is living in Patna, not, I'm afraid, in Bengal. Very close, but not quite to Bengal. But Brahmagupta, perhaps more improbably, sitting in Rajasthan on Mount Abu, comes up with the insight that zero is not an absence, a placeholder, but is a number with its own qualities. That it is, for example, the number you get when you subtract a number from itself. He makes 30 rules. And from that insight, this meditating on this idea of sunya, the void, which is a deep idea in Hindu and Buddhist philosophy and Jain philosophy, that with zero, you get place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. You get the door opens to higher mathematics, binary algorithms, algebra. And the astonishing fact that the number system we all use every day is on every laptop. This laptop in front of us has these numbers. But I can guarantee that no one in this room, unless, again, possibly they were brought up in South Asia, will know that those numbers came from India. We call them in the West Arabic numbers because that's where Europe gets them from. So it's not an unreasonable name if you're sitting in Europe. But we've totally written India out of the picture. So this book is in danger of making me sound like the mad uncle in Sanjeev Bhaskar's Goodness Gracious Me that shouts, India, Leonardo da Vinci, India. And I'm sure many of you in this room do have mad uncles who send WhatsApp forwards about India inventing the internet, and which is probably why this book hasn't been written by an Indian, because you don't want to sound like the crazy uncle on WhatsApp saying that the Mahabharata had nuclear weapons and all the rest of it. But there is genuinely, without sort of, sounding either like a sort of crazy leftist talking about decolonization or whatever, there is a huge body of the world's learning, arts, literature, and philosophy, which India gave to the world, which were not taught in our education. And the place where it dawned on me that this book was something that really needed to be written and that it was a book was Angkor Wat. This incredible building, which is the largest medieval religious building on Earth. The moat that you can see in the top right-hand corner of this encloses an area 4 times the Vatican City. And it's a Hindu temple. Originally, it's a temple to Vishnu, but it's not in India. It's 4,000 miles away from India in Cambodia. And wandering around Angkor Wat, as I've done many times, you always see these Desi families who've come on holiday, and they astonished to find images of Krishna and the gopis, or the Battle of Lanka and Hanuman's monkeys attacking Ravana, or images of Kurukshetra and the Pandava brothers, and so on. And even the Indians who are there looking at these are astonished to find that what is it doing in Cambodia? How is our culture so very far away from home? And so it seemed to me that it was worth pulling together these ideas. And I pulled it together under 3 headings, which I'm sure we're going to go through the book in this manner. So first of all, the whole body of Indian learning, which is Buddhism. often not associated with India either, because obviously Buddhism today flourishes far from India, in Tibet, in Laos, in Thailand, in Burma, and Sri Lanka. And while there are Buddhists in India, often they are Dalit Buddhists in the south, or Tibetan Buddhists in Ladakh. And again, not something many people naturally associate with Indic philosophy, with Indian ideas. It's something that today that seems a little foreign to India, and yet it is deeply Indian. And these ideas are formed on the banks of the Ganges. The Buddha is born in Lumbini today, just over the border in Nepal. He has his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya in Bihar again. And he preaches his first sermon in Sarnath, just outside Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh. And yet these ideas, which don't immediately spread, there's a gap of about 200 years when they're just one among a number of philosophies circulating in North India. But under Ashoka, they suddenly are projected outwards, right down to the Deccan, to South India, beyond to Sri Lanka. He sends Dharma ministers out around 250 BCE to as far as Cyrene, modern Libya. And Ashoka's contribution is to make Buddhism this extraordinary world religion, which in a matter of 300 or 400 years takes Indian languages, Indian learning, Indian philosophy, as well as the ideas of Buddhism itself, out northwest up to Gandhara and Pakistan, south to Sri Lanka, Burma, southeast to Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, up through Lhasa to Chang'an, conquers China, goes beyond to Mongolia and Siberia. And again, this is something that Indians are not particularly aware of, because Buddhism is not something that is in the kind of the bag of tricks that Indians are proud of. The incredible spread of that religion is not really understood. And with it comes these concepts of circular time, of Sanskrit and Prakrit and geography, the idea of Jambudvipa, Mount Meru being central to the universe, all this whole backpack of ideas spreads with it. So that's the first package, and hugely important. Then there's a second wave, a little bit later, 500-600 AD onwards, when Hindu kingship and Sanskrit and the whole package of Hindu ideas form deep roots in Southeast Asia. And Buddhism has spread often with the merchants and with trade. Hinduism is something associated with courts and kingship and rulers. Merchants like Buddhism because it allows them to make lots of money and then sort of greenwash themselves with a dedication to a Buddhist temple. And suddenly, by building a janta or a lora or whatever it is, suddenly their sins are forgiven. Rulers, however, do not like Buddhism because it requires them to be non-violent. And what's the point of being a king if you can't have a good battle? And so the kings always prefer Hinduism, and it spreads as a kingly court culture in Southeast Asia. And then the third body of ideas is, again, later than that, about 800 AD, Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta's ideas of mathematics spread out of India to the Arab world, and we'll probably talk about this at greater length later, but just briefly, from the Arab world, and then spreads to Europe from there. And that's where we get our numbers. That's where we get 0. This whole body of stuff, which is normally separated off into different disciplines. So one department of the university will study Buddhism, and there'll be Buddhist studies and Prakrit. Another university department, another, usually a different gallery in a museum, will present or teach about Hinduism and Sanskrit and that whole package of things. And then, the history of religion and the history of maths, if it's taught at all, which it usually isn't, is in the science or the mathematics departments. So this stuff has been separated, but I think it's one thing. It's the spread of this huge body of Indic knowledge and philosophy And it's my contention in this book that it's this transformative force that changes the world.
And it wasn't just Angkor Wat. You also write in the book it was this map of the spread of Roman coins and how they were not found in China, which one would have imagined. The bulk of them were found outside the old Roman Empire in India. What did that signify to you?
You started with talking about Pliny. And there is this strange thing whereby I talked just introduced at the beginning this idea that we're brought up with the Greeks like Pythagoras and Archimedes, but not taught about Aryabhata and Brahmagupta. There's also happened more recently, within the last 30, 40 years, this idea where there's been this terrific education in the West, often through books and exhibitions about the Silk Road, which has become an accepted idea with a capital S and a capital R, as if it's an established fact. And it's an idea which works on all sorts of different levels. It works on the Netflix level. You get movies of Marco Polo and beautiful Mongol princesses. It works on an exhibition level. I was in the Asian Art Museum this afternoon. There's a little section on the Silk Road there. It works on a geopolitical level. In that the Belt and Road has been it's founded on this idea that there was a east-west motorway called the Silk Road, which linked the Mediterranean and the South China Sea. But in reality, this is an idea which is an entirely modern one. Marco Polo never talks about the Silk Road. No ancient source, Western or Eastern, talks about the Silk Road. It's an invented term, originally dreamt up in German by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen. Nerds who went to the sort of education I had may have heard of the Red Baron, the flying ace, who was the kind of greatest German fighter pilot of the First World War. And anyway, he's the grandson of this guy who came up with the notion of the Seidenstraßen, the Silk Roads. And that was originally an idea of a railway line which would link Berlin with Peking, as it then was, which was never built, but became an idea. And then it appears in English for the first time in 1936 in a book called The Silk Road by Sven Hedin, who's a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer. And suddenly in the 1980s, this idea burgeons. And when I'm at college, there are wonderful books following the Silk Road. The Karakoram Highway opens up and allows travelers to go. I myself went on my first book in Xanadu following this thing. And it's become an established fact. In reality, it is often a misleading idea because it certainly existed. First of all, it's an idea that means many different things to different people. So in its most simplistic form, it's an east-west motorway that sort of leaves from sort of Antioch, Mediterranean coast, and in a horizontal line, just heads through Anatolia, through Persia, through Central Asia, through these wonderfully romantic names like Samarkand, Tashkent, and Merv, through to Chang'an, Xi'an, and the Chinese ports. Now, there are many other versions. For example, the great Peter Frankopan has a much more sophisticated thing, which basically means it just was trading routes, and he has a much more loose idea of it. But it has come to create a notion which is a fundamental untruth, which is that there's an eternal road, a motorway which existed, which crossed Asia, which allowed people to go in both directions, and that silk was the biggest product and that China was the natural destination. In reality, in the classical period, in the early period, in the period of Pliny that we're talking about, he dies at the eruption of Pompeii in AD 79. So that's when Pliny's writing, first century. Contemporary of Jesus Christ, in fact, and Augustus. In Pliny's time, there was absolutely no notion of China in Rome, and vice versa. In later Roman periods, you get a vague notion in China of Daquin, which is possibly this power in the West, but sort of semi-fantastic. And equally, In Rome, there's this idea of Ceres or Thena, which is this rich city where silk comes from. But again, it's a very nebulous idea because no one's seen it, no one's been there. And while Rome and China, there is not a single 100% verified account of any diplomatic mission or any trading mission that ever passed between the two. While that is the case between Rome and China, between Rome and India, we have in Pliny and in Strabo accounts not just of one or two explorers having gone to this exploring journey, annual trading fleets of 250 vessels traveling not over land, but with the monsoon winds by sea. And they leave, well, this is the map here, we've got it. They leave what's here called Musselhammer, which is a slightly unhelpful translation of Myos Hormuz, and Berenike, which is the one below it. And with the monsoon winds, they can cross to Kerala. As you can see on this map, it's an easy journey. It takes 6 weeks. And then the other crucial factor is if you look above India, you see the white of the Tibetan plateau. Look how enormous that is. So that's the crucial thing, because the freezing over of that vast area every winter, the winds blow it, rake in to Tibet with the cold winds in winter. And then it thaws in the spring and warm winds blow out. And that freezing and thawing over this continental size area of mountain and snow creates the monsoon winds, which uniquely and unlike anywhere else in the world that I know of, reverse themselves neatly. So for half the year, they're blowing in one direction. They're blowing from the west coast of India towards the Red Sea. And then they neatly reverse themselves and sail back again. So India has this massive unfair advantage over any other country in the world that you've got to put up a sail in Kerala in August, and you're blown turbo-driven straight over to the Red Sea. We Scots didn't have that. Our winds go crazy different directions at different times, but Indian sailors had this thing. And then they can go, once you've got to Berenike or Myos Hormuz, you sail up the Nile, you sell your goods in Alexandria, you go and see a show, go and visit the pyramids, have a nice time. And then you've got to get back to the port by about March, and then the winds reverse and you're blown equally fast back again. So you can do the whole journey and back in a year. And people did. And Strabo, who's a geographer based in Alexandria at this period, describes taking the new Roman governor for a trip to show him his new posting. And he says, when they get to Myos Hormuz, they see 250 vessels waiting there, ready to sail. So this was a massive business. These were whole trading fleets, which is why, going back to the picture of the coins, when you look at the map of Roman trade represented by coin find, this is every orange dot on that represents a coin hoard. In other words, where 100 or more Roman coins have turned up in a pot or something. And as you'd imagine, most of them are in Europe. Most of them in France, Italy, Greece, Spain, southern Britain. But Roman trade also spreads up to the Black Sea and down to the southern shores of the Mediterranean. Then there's a little orange tail for the Nile, people trading all the way up and down the Nile. But look where the Silk Road's meant to be, going directly east from Anatolia. There's nothing. There's a couple of little orange dots in Afghanistan. Not one single Roman coin hoard has ever been found in China. But then look at the bottom right-hand corner and look at India. Huge orange smudge of orange. So basically, this idea of the Silk Road in the classical period is, to put it crudely, and it obscures a real, genuine, massive trading fleet, which went not over land with camels and saddlebags, but went by the sea on these dotted lines in vast fleets. And that goes on as long as Rome is operational. It starts with the death of Antony and Cleopatra. Augustus takes Egypt, and suddenly India and the Roman world are in direct contact. And for 500 years, that is the big trading thing linking East and West. So it isn't that the Silk Road doesn't exist. There are east-west trading routes overland that have gone on for centuries, but there's no motorway that links the two, and there's absolutely no conception of Rome or China in the classical period. At the time that the Silk Road becomes a really big deal and actually is something that you can draw a line on a map about is in the Mongol period, when Genghis Khan smashes through Persia and links the Mediterranean with the South China Sea. And at that point, Marco Polo does go in 1271, all the way from Jerusalem with the pot of oil from the Holy Sepulchre and delivers it to Xanadu in Inner Mongolia, Kublai Khan's palace north of Beijing. And so there's a real definite east-west overland trade route during the Mongol period, but that's 1270. This early period, India is the focus, and it's by sea.
So what was the milieu? India wasn't an unknown factor. Prior to the Romans, the Greeks were here, and they all understood at least abstractly the idea of India and its wealth. What led to the explosion? Was it the Battle of Alexandria that you just alluded to? What?
The Battle of Actium.
Actium, yes.
Yeah. The Battle of Actium is when Augustus defeats Antony Cleopatra. Augustus annexes Ptolemaic Egypt to the Roman Empire, and suddenly Rome has its front door with India. And it has a major influence in both directions. There are tons of Indian goods reaching, and Indian ideas reaching Europe, such as this wonderful yakshi, found in Pompeii. You also get Roman goods turning up all over India and Afghanistan in reverse. Transforms Buddhist art. So here you have the Gandharan art, which we saw wonderful examples in the Asian Art Museum today. The Brits loved to read their Kipling, and they linked these Gandharan sculptures, like the one on the right, with the man who would be king, and sort of the idea of Alexander's lost legion stuck in the Hindu Kush. Again, pure. By the time that these things have gone, the last legions of Alexander have been out of the picture for 250 years. The amazing similarity of Roman and Gandharan art at this period, and in the Asian Art Museum, just a short distance from here, you have these wonderful tritons and sea animals that look as if they're straight off a Roman sculpture, a Roman temple. The reason that is that a lot of Roman goods are reaching India, and they're transforming the way people imagine the divine, and in particular, they transform the way people conceive and depict the Buddha. And the earliest images of the Buddha are aniconic. In other words, the Buddha is represented by a wheel of the law, the Dharma wheel, or by a flaming pillar, or by a stupa. And then suddenly in the 1st century, exactly as this trade route is getting going, exactly as Augustus is taking over Rome, exactly as Strabo and Pliny are writing their books, suddenly, bing, the Buddha appears in a toga. And of course, it's the influence of Roman trade. So trade travels in both directions. And there are very important legacies of Roman thought and Roman trade in India, but and equally ideas from even mathematics, like Euclid, reaches India, known as the Yavana Sutras, the Greek texts.
So,
but we've forgotten this whole world of mutual influence, and it's not taught and it's not widely known.
let us now switch to the idea of Buddhism, which is central in your book, about how it spread. And as you admit, it was a forgotten religion even after the death of its founder. And then suddenly, 200 years later, it spreads. There's vast educational institutes that talk about the idea of Buddhism, and then it spreads to China, it spreads to the world. How did that happen?
So what we're looking at here is Nalanda, which, again, will be familiar to the Indians in the audience, but almost certainly not at all familiar to anyone not brought up in India. So Nalanda is the Indian equivalent of the Library of Alexandria. And we're all brought up in the West with the idea of this incredible repository of all the learning of the world, which is destroyed, depending on which version you believe, by the monks of the early Christians, or by the early Arab conquests. It's probably the monks in reality. Anyway, the monastery of Nalanda is its equivalent in Asia. And Xuanzang, who's this wonderful traveler monk who travels all the way from China to study at Nalanda, is one of 3 eyewitness accounts that we have surviving of this place. And he describes a 9-story library with 3 divisions. Anyone can borrow any manuscript, but they have to put it in a pigeonhole in the central courtyard at night. They can't take it to their rooms and overnight for some reason. There's the law. And this is what has been excavated. Now, only 1/10 of Nalanda has been dug, so there's maybe great treasures still there. And if I was the current government of India and was trying to big up the idea of India shining, there's nothing that I would do first other than excavate the rest of Nalanda and build a cracking museum. At the moment, there's this shabby thing with sort of strip lights and dusty exhibits. It's really shocking, but this could be, the greatest propaganda coup for Indian learning and Indian knowledge systems you could imagine, because everyone was coming not just from China, Japan, Korea. There were expatriate college set up by the king of Srivijaya, which is Indonesia. We have the copper plate where he sets up this, rather like the Mahindas have the Humanities Institute at Harvard, you had the Srivijaya College at Nalanda. And the most striking thing is, look at that plan. Courtyard, scholars' rooms leading off it. Where does that look like? It's Oxbridge. Or indeed Harvard. And there is a very good argument to be made that that's not chance, that plan, a courtyard with scholars' rooms on 2 stories leading off it, starts off in Nalanda, and it spreads up to the Buddhist monasteries in Central Asia and Afghanistan, and that it then gets taken on by the Islamic world, and it becomes the model for the madrasa. And if you think of the great madrasas of Islam, they're also courtyards. Today we think of madrasas associated with terrorism. That's our problem. That's not that madrasa just means place of learning, and it is some of the greatest institutes of learning in world history have been the madrasas, spreading all the way from Afghanistan right through to Al-Azhar in Cairo. But for our purposes, through North Africa to Islamic Spain, and the first universities in the West with these plans are on the edge of Islamic Spain. They're in southern Italy, in Salerno, in Bologna, in Paris, and then a century later, Oxford and Cambridge. I think it is a thing. I think that is the model of our university courtyards. But it's however you want to dress it up, you have this succession, not of one but of 10 courtyards running down the length of London. It's like Oxford High Street. It's this whole succession of colleges on a single road, and people came to study here from all over Asia. It's the Harvard, it's the Yale, it's the NASA of its day, and this great repository which survives up until the 12th century.
And in your book, you mention it was the royal patronage that led to the rise of Buddhism after many years after the death of the founder, in India through Ashok, and in China through. Could you expand?
Sure. So Buddhism spreads along the trade routes, and we have often in this country and in the West generally this very ethereal idea of Buddhism as this sort of slightly otherworldly religion. Often in Hollywood films, Buddhist lamas hover just above the ground and have sort of amazing supernatural powers like Marvel heroes. In reality, early Buddhism is very capitalist, and which isn't to in any way undermine its spiritual component, but to say that the practical functioning of Buddhist monasteries was such that they lent money. They were the first banks. They set up along trade routes. Their main patrons are merchants. And they are part of the trade network. We have these inscriptions from people saying, this is to mark me repaying a loan of 60 lakh rupees, which I borrowed from the monastery in Andhra Pradesh. And I repay it here with interest. And thanks to this, I was able to buy a boat and go to Savanabhumi, the lands of gold, Southeast Asia, and have made a fortune. Now I come back and repay my debt to the monks. And there's many of these inscriptions in coastal monasteries. And monasteries were often on the coast. The stupas were often on the hills. Lighthouse, the Pharos lighthouse of Alexandria, guiding ships across the sea into the harbour. So these white stupas could be seen from far out at sea and were points that ships make for. But you also get, in the case of Ashok and many other early kings, Kanishka, the Kushan king, royal patronage. And a crucial bit of the story in the book is this story of this woman not well known in the West, Wu Zetian. And she is this extraordinary figure who's the only woman emperor in 3,000 years of Chinese dynastic history. And she takes over as emperor. She's initially a concubine, then a wife, then an empress. And then the husband has a stroke and she takes over, and then he dies and she becomes emperor. Only one. You have at other time in history powerful dowager duchesses, dowager empresses, and so on. But she's the only emperor who's a woman. And she does this by basically kicking out the Confucians and kicking out the Taoists and putting Buddhist monks from Nalanda. And she has this sort of think tank. And she does convert China to Buddhism. China takes on an Indian religion. The only time in world history when China, the most conservative, the most self-confident civilization of all, takes on a foreign. I mean, compare with the British attempts to try and woo China in the 18th century. Lord Macartney spends 4 years gathering hot air balloons, telescopes, everything that 18th century Britain can wow people with, and makes its way to Beijing. Where the emperor tells them merely, we have no need of your knickknacks. And they have to go home, pack it all up again and go home. But at this period, out of self-interest and a whole lot of very pragmatic thinking in court, Wu Zetian converts China to Buddhism for one generation. And it becomes the state religion. So yes, we have state patron. That's a long answer.
Let's switch gears a little bit now. Let's talk about the idea of zero. What was it about that time in India? Could you describe it for our audience that led to all these ideas, these abstract ideas coming together? Was there a single civilization that drove it? Were there multiple regions that came together? What was the milieu of those times?
So the first thing to be said is that India does not exist as a single nation state, obviously, at this time. And I've been very loosely talking about India and perhaps giving the impression that it is a nation state that looks like the modern map of India. That's not the case. India is notably diffuse in its governing structures. And even compared to Southeast Asia, today, Southeast Asia is split into Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, all that. At that period, or in the 9th, 10th, 11th century, the kingdom, the Khmer Empire is one state, but you never get that. You briefly have a moment with Ashoka. You briefly have a moment with North India united under the Guptas, but generally India is marked by rival mandalas of rival kings. And as a result, they never quite have the same patronage power as the kings of Southeast Asia, which is why Angkor Wat is so bigger than any. While Angkor's developed out of Indian ideas, it's a much bigger temple than any one Indian temple. Even the great temples of the Cholas are tiny compared to Angkor. So India has these different political structures, but it is one civilization, and India conceives itself from very early on as one geographical space called Bharat, or Jambudvipa in the case of the Buddhist kingdoms. And it's defined very clearly, which is much the same as the map of modern India, which is no accident, because when Gandhi and Nehru and the early freedom fighters are designing their India, they actually reject great chunks of territory. This is the subject of my son Sam's book, Shattered Lands, which is out at the moment. And the British lump in Burma, for example, which is part of British India. British India spreads all the way from Yemen to the borders of Thailand in the 1900s and 1920s. When Gandhi and so on are fighting for freedom, they basically say, we don't want Burma. And they turned down Dubai and Abu Dhabi, which is a big mistake. All that oil could have been Indian. And they say, no, it's not Bharatvarsh. And Bharatvarsh is this very clear idea in Indian minds from very early on. It's in the Mahabharata, and it's the Ganges on the east, the Indus on the west, the Himalayas to the north, and the sea to the south. And that's Bharatvarsh. It's never one political unit, ever. But it's a concept of India, which is a geographical and cultural reality. And within that, you have, in these early centuries, something which is rather different to the kind of, if I may say, RSS, BJP, patriotic sort of concept of India as an intellectual superpower, in that it is amazingly intellectually curious and cosmopolitan. If you look at the pictures of the crowds in Ajanta and those wall paintings, there are Greeks, there are Romans, there are Ethiopians, there are people from Southeast Asia in those crowds. And India at that period is not a sort of sealed piece of Tupperware with this pure India, Shuddh India. On the contrary, it's taking ideas from Babylon, from Egypt, from Rome, from the Greeks, and it's putting them together. And which is what happens, of course, in this country at its best, when you have at Harvard people meeting from all over the world, the best of the best, the greatest minds, exchanging ideas, fighting with each other, squabbling, coming together. And that's how intellectual advances take place. And that's the impression you get of ancient India, is that it's a place very open to intellectual discourse.
And how do these ideas spread? Ironically, we've talked about a lot of soft power, but you also mentioned in your book that there were the fall of Balkh, the Reconquista in Spain, that led to these ideas permeating from one region to the other. What point were you trying to make?
So Buddhism and Hinduism's very remarkably spread without bloodshed. Christianity, obviously, look at the conquistadors in Mexico, whatever, spreads by the sword at times. Islam also at times spreads by the sword, though not always. But you can genuinely say that this incredible spread of Indian ideas is one of soft power. And it's an almost unique instance of a vast empire of ideas, which at no point is propelled by conquest and by armies. It's propelled, in the case of Buddhism, by traders and trade routes and monasteries that are open to trade. And it's, in the case of Hinduism, by kings who pragmatically see advantage really in adopting Hindu kingship in Southeast Asia. But you're right. In the idea of mathematics and the story of its spread to the West is a story of an extraordinary moment in the 8th century, when Baghdad is founded by the Abbasid dynasty. And the Abbasids have come to power thanks to the brilliant accounting. There's an Indian accountant, like behind every great software company in Silicon Valley, and indeed programmers. There is, in this case, an extraordinary tale of an Indian dynasty of accountants who, through brilliant mathematics and supply, allowed the Abbasids to defeat their enemies, the Umayyads. And these accountants are Buddhist monks, Buddhist abbots. Their Sanskritic name is Pramukh, which gets Arabicized to Barmak. And they become a dynasty called the Barmakids, who are the viziers of Baghdad. And they appear in, we got this image here, they appear in
Aladdin.
Well, first of all, in the Arabian Nights, in the where Jafar is the friend of Harun al-Rashid, and then it turns into the Disney Aladdin. And Jafar here is a real character, and it's his family, him and his father and his grandfather, who send to the nearest Hindu kingdom, which is Sindh, for Indian mathematicians to bring the works of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta, these two great intellectuals we talked about. And they bring this book, which they call the Great Sindh Hind, all the way from Sindh to Baghdad. And then there's various early attempts to translate it, because Aryabhatta, in addition to having discovered the circumference of the earth, pushes his mathematical textbook down into a tiny rhyming poem that is memorizable by kids, of incredible density and complexity. And it's almost impossible to translate into Arabic. But eventually a genius turns up 2 generations later called Al-Khwarizmi, who translates it as the book of balancing and completion according to Hindu calculation. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, so it's always known with a nickname, which is Al-Jabr, which is our word algebra. And Al-Khwarizmi becomes the basis for our word algorithm. So the algorithm and algebra are 2 concepts that come to us from this meeting of the Arab and the Indic worlds. And those ideas spread through North Africa to Spain. And this wonderful diagram, which should be taught in every school in the world, but somehow isn't, shows where we get our numbers from. It starts off as Brahmi at the time of Ashoka. It then becomes this more familiar-looking system, and Gwalior, and then it splits in 3. And the numbers on the right are the ones that we see it carrying on in India. Similar but different numbers in East Arabic, still used today across the Arab world and in Persia. And then there's a slightly different set, which become the norm in Morocco, Algeria, and in Islamic Spain. And by the 16th century, that is our... Now, the big question is, how does it get from Jafar in Baghdad to us in Europe, to the Western world in Europe? And it takes a long time. It spreads very quickly through the Arab world. And by the 8th century, end of the 8th century, everyone's using these numbers across the Arab world. A few monks and scholars in Barcelona are using it by the 10th century, but it somehow doesn't spread. People carry on using Roman numerals, XV, CX. I mean, you can't try even giving your phone number to someone in Roman numerals. It takes half an hour. XV, XV, and then try doing long multiplication in Roman numbers. It's even... But somehow it's only a bunch of scholars who take it on. And then there's this weird chance moment when Pisa, in 1132, I think, decides to found a colony in what's now a trading colony in Algeria. The Venetians have gone off and taken over the whole of the Dalmatian coast and towards Constantinople, and the Pisans to the west are trying to find other places that they can dominate and trade with. So they make a deal with the kingdom that's in Algeria, and they set up a trading colony in a place called Bujaya, which is also incidentally where Camus, Oran today, where Camus wrote The Plague, and French Algerian sort of... Anyway, he brings his kid, and the kid, like my son's going to school in Delhi and learning Hindi and ultimately Sanskrit. This kid learns Arabic. And as a matter of course, by this period, learns the Al-Khwarizmi Al-Jabr at school. It's just what kids are taught by their teens by the 12th century in Algeria. And eventually he goes back home with his dad, aged 18, and finds that all his mates in Pisa are still trying to do XVX divided by CXMVC. So he writes a book called the Liber Abaci, explaining this in Latin to Europeans, or specifically people of Pisa, actually, initially. And that kid is Fibonacci. And it's Fibonacci who brings it to Europe. And then there's another lucky break when he happens to be there doing this at the time when he has one of the most enlightened Christian rulers of the whole Middle Ages, who's a guy called Frederick II, known quite rightly as Stupor Mundi, the wonder of the world. And Stupor Mundi, sitting in Palermo, hears about this new wonder kid who's written this amazing book. And he goes up to Pisa to meet him. Imagine Trump going to Detroit to meet someone who's won some mathematical contest. It's not going to happen. But Stupor Mundi does. And then he takes this kid to one amazing castle called Castel del Monte, which is from Trani in southern Italy, where he introduces him to a Scotsman. Very important moment. And that Scot is called Michael Scott, who in the Borders, where I grew up, is known as Michael Scott the Wizard because he was a mathematician and they all thought this was a very strange, supernatural thing. Anyway, Michael Scott is a real character. He wasn't a wizard. He was a scientist. And he reads Fibonacci's Liber Abaci and says, look, kid, this is great, but it's a wee bit theoretical, he says. You need to be a wee bit more practical. And so he says you've got to add interest rates, weights and measures, currency conversion, all this sort of stuff that will be used by merchants. And Fibonacci is modest enough to take this advice, and so he produces a second edition of the Liber Abaci dedicated to Michael Scott and Frederick II, which becomes the textbook for mathematics in Renaissance Italy. And not only is it used by, for example, the Medicis in the founding of the Medici Bank and the whole revolution in banking which takes place in early Italy, it's also used by the painters when they're calculating perspectives. So the whole Renaissance, and one of the first painters to take on Fibonacci's maths is Piero della Francesco, a great painter, who writes 3 treatises based on Fibonacci's thesis. And those 3 texts are carried after Piero della Francesco's death up to Milan by a man called Fra Luca Pacioli. And Fra Luca Pacioli shows it to his flatmate, who's a jobbing painter, painting a painting of the Last Supper in a convent in Milan. It's Leonardo da Vinci. So in just 5 leaps, you go from Leonardo in Milan to Fibonacci in Pisa in Algeria, to Al-Khwarizmi in Baghdad, to Brahmagupta sitting on the Nabu, and then Aryabhatta in Patna.
What led to the decline? Yes, please.
Why not taught this? This is really important stuff.
What led to the decline of the trade routes?
So, first thing that happens is that Rome falls, and all those wonderful ships crossing backs and forwards from Egypt to India, that packs up with the fall of Rome. And one of the results of that is that India pivots from looking westwards towards Rome and the west coast ports like Babaricum, which is roughly where Karachi is at the mouth of the Indus, Muziris, which is in Kerala, and so on. At the 5th century, at the time of the fall of Rome, that's when you get Nagapattinam Tamralipti, which is in Bengal. And these are looking eastwards, and they're looking for new sources of gold, Savarnabhumi. So that's the period at which India begins to look towards it, and then that ultimately leads to Angkor Wat and all that kind of stuff. So the whole, if you like, the first period is looking westwards, the second period is looking eastwards. So that isn't a decline, actually. The shock of the fall of Rome leads to whole new avenues of Indic knowledge and Indic influence. But every great civilization has its peaks and its troughs, and India's becoming less innovative by the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And it then finds itself militarily outmoded and the Turks who are coming in, same Turks, cousins of the same guys who are conquering Byzantium and the Battle of Manzikert and moving into Anatolia, first cousins of those same Turks, crash down through the Himalayas, through the Khyber Pass, take Lahore, then they take Delhi, 1192. And it's partly the destruction that the Turks themselves caused, but it's also a symptom of Indian decline that they're there at all, because in the great days, India would have been militarily above all these guys, and it isn't by the 12th century. So there is a terrific amount of iconoclasm and burning and Nalanda at this period, probably, certainly many other Buddhist universities are burnt. But then the next thing that happens is that the Mongols turn up, and the Turks in India defeat the Mongols. And two things happen. First of all, you get massive wave of refugees from these cities like Merv and Samarkand and so on. And a lot of Persian refugees come down and settle in Delhi. So this is the period when Persian becomes the next. So Sanskrit's replaced by Persian. And India is like this very rich cake that has three layers. You have the Sanskrit layer at the bottom, you have the Persian layer, and then later, of course, you get the English layer above that. So you get three decks of culture. But as well as becoming Persianate, the Mongols do not conquer India, but they do conquer everywhere east and west. So you get a new boundary cutting India off from the Himalayas. And there are no longer those overland routes which the monks had been taking up to China. So India's cut off from that. And yeah, you lose that whole source of inspiration. So it's the double thing of triple thing, I suppose: the decline followed by conquest, followed by isolation. And India remains a hugely wealthy country. So in a sense, it's a bit silly to talk of decline, because as late as the 18th century, India is producing 40% of the world's GDP, which we forget. Which is why the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British, then the French, and then lots of other weirdos like the Swedes, the Danes, and everyone else turn up. And they turn up because it's so very rich. You want to go to India because it's Silicon Valley.
We're coming almost near the end of the time. Let's start with your own personal story. On a personal note, it started with the tracing of the old Silk Route, with going to Xanadu and pouring the oil all over the grave of Genghis Khan, as anyone who's read knows.
The Kubla Khan Pledge Palace.
Yes. Has it now come full circle with the prequel, and is there going to be a sequel to this book?
I'm not sure what to do next. I personally am very upset what's going on in Gaza at the moment, and I'm quite keen to write a history of Palestine, which seems to not be available. It seems a moment to that's a story that needs telling, because there's a whole extraordinary story of the people of that country, which is not widely available and not widely known. And just like I felt that the story of India's greatness was not known, the whole story of the Palestinians seems to me something of importance at the moment, which is not widely known. So that's what I'm toying with at the moment. I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm doing it though. I'm flying it as a bit of a kite in the Empire podcast, which is my other great preoccupation at the moment. And we've got a 12-hour history of Gaza, which began this week. So we'll see how that goes. It's obviously highly controversial territory, and it can make you very popular with some people, less popular with others, I think it's fair to say. But I think it's important, because I think it isn't widely known. And to as neutrally and factually as possible to give that history seems to be an important job at the moment.
And we shall all wait for it with great interest, and there's no doubt. A question from the audience. One question was, what was the lingua franca in those days? In Nalanda, if you came to study, what was the lingua franca?
So there was no one lingua franca in that the language of Buddhist scholarship tended to be both Prakrit and Sanskrit. Prakrit was the Indian vernacular. Sanskrit was the sacred language. And it was part of the Buddha's appeal that he spoke not in the language of the courts and the kings, which is Sanskrit, but in the language of the ordinary people. And when Buddhism spread, it spread initially using Prakrit. But nonetheless, the language of scholarship in India has always been Sanskrit. So, and the great period, which begins with the 6th century onwards, is when Sanskrit moves from being the language only of the gods, the language used by the priests and used only in the temples and for sacred matters, which is where it begins. So the Vedas are written in Sanskrit, as are the Puranas. But in the 6th century, suddenly kings start making inscriptions in Sanskrit about other stuff, about their conquests, about the things they've built, things they've done. And Sanskrit moves from being the language of the gods to being the language used all the way from Kandahar to Bali, and becomes, for a period of 700 or 800 years, the diplomatic language of learning and of courtly activity all the way through Southeast Asia, right through it. So if you were a Cambodian, you could communicate with someone in Afghanistan through Sanskrit.
You end the book with a lament. It was trade that brought the Western powers to the subcontinent. But you also hark back to this complex, pluralistic society that gave rise to these ideas. You're against the clash of civilization, of the absorbing of these ideas. You see an India as it moves more towards its own concept of what Hinduism is, further and further away from what made it great in the first place.
I think all civilizations develop through dialogue and through openness and being willing to discuss things and discuss it openly. It's the mingling of civilizations that leads to intellectual advances and the spread of ideas. And when civilizations begin to look inwards and to be arrogant and refuse to take in new ideas, that's when they get stagnant. That's my view.
And on that note, we'll end tonight's program. Thank you all. Thank you.